today's World Insights with Xin Wei, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte on his 5th visit to China bodes well for closer neighborly ties. And the U.S. Space Command launched. Amid global security concerns, could it spark a space race?
And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We start today's program in the Chinese capital, where Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte on Thursday. It's Mr. Duterte's 5th trip to China since taking office 3 years ago, and was just in Beijing 4 months ago for an international forum on the Belt and Road Initiative. So how are ties between China and the Philippines looking up? Before we get down to a discussion with our panelists, take a look at the meeting between Chinese President and the Filipino counterpart.
China and the Philippines on track for closer neighborly relations. After meeting with his Philippine counterpart Rodrigo Duterte in Beijing on Thursday, Chinese President Xi Jinping said despite international and regional uncertainties, further China-Philippine cooperation will make a positive contribution to regional stability. Ties between Beijing and Manila had some twists and turns back in 2016 over the South China Sea. But under President Xi and Mr. Duterte's guidance, the two countries have chosen to take a friendlier approach and return to communication and cooperation. China became the Philippines' largest trading partner and has retained the position ever since. The two partners have also been actively seeking to synergize their development plans, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Build program. President Xi's state visit to Manila in 2018, the first for a Chinese head of state in 13 years. The Philippines is a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Mr. Duterte has yet to make a trip to the White House. On his 5th visit to China, the Philippine president is walking a tightrope between the two world powers, which are engulfed in a trade war.
For more on the latest between China and the Philippines, let's loop in our panelists. In Taipei, we have Richard Hedatrian, who is a political science professor at De La Salle University in Manila. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Douglas Paul, a distinguished fellow from the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Senior Captain Zhang Junshe, Vice President of the Naval Research Institute of China. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Hedatrian, we understand that the Chinese vessel owner, which eventually sank a Filipino vessel, fishing boat, back in June, apologized to the Philippine side, and it was accepted, the apology. What kind of message is it sending about two sides' attitude now about this issue?
Well, as far as the Philippine-China relationship is concerned, we're looking at the two-level interaction. As far as the Philippine government and President Duterte's relationship with Beijing is concerned, it's, I think, the golden age of bilateral relationship. And in the span of 3 years, you and I have been discussing this relationship for the span of 3 years. We went from a toxic bilateral relationship to one of the friendliest relationships in this part of the world. And the Philippines is not only a major non-NATO ally of the U.S., it's also the country coordinator for ASEAN and China. So it occupies a very important role. So to have the Philippines on the side of China broadly, as far as President Duterte is concerned, is a positive thing. But as far as the public opinion is concerned in the Philippines, there has been some backsliding. If you look at the SWS survey in the Philippines the other month, China's approval ratings actually went down in the Philippines. And more Filipinos are asking the president to take a tougher line, including some of his top defense officials, Defense Secretary Lorenzana and National Security Advisor Esperon. So we have this two-level game going on there, and this is the complexity that we have to take into consideration.
And as a result of that, Mr. Zhang, Senior Captain, what does that, which is now termed by the Filipino side as little maritime incident, mean to the bilateral relations? Obviously, it seems that things have smoothed up recently.
Well, I think that means the fishing incident between two countries, not only between China and the Philippines, I think also between other countries, the Philippines and Vietnamese and other fishing boats often have some accidents at sea. I think the two sides have taken an appropriate attitude toward this accident. I think this is not intended to be hostile to the Philippines.
We also joined by Mr. Paul from the United States, even though this is a bilateral talk between China and the Philippines, but as an ally of the Philippines, the United States, how do you see the South China Sea issue is still relevant at all in the bilateral relations between China and the Philippines? And how is Washington looking at all the latest development, including this quite impressive state visit by the Philippine President to China?
Well, I think the strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, remains the operational guidance for the present administration in Washington. And we saw on his most recent visit to the Philippines that Secretary of State Pompeo made clear, or reasserted for the first time in quite a while, that the South China Sea falls within the purview of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines. And so I think they're actively trying to stay engaged in the game and to try to provide some counterbalance to the growing weight in China's relationship with Manila.
Mr. Hidarian, of course, we have seen the turn of policies since Mr. Duterte became the president 3 years ago. Now, he's been trying to advocate more closer ties with China, particularly regarding trade and infrastructure investment. So how do you think the current administration is trying to balance it between two powers, shall we say, in the region and beyond, the China and the U.S., particularly about the areas of cooperation, about this dramatic change?
Well, the first thing we have to keep in mind is that President Rodrigo Duterte, in fact, introduced a revolutionary element in the Philippine foreign policy. For almost a century, our bilateral relationship with the U.S. was considered as sacred and sacrosanct. In fact, it was internalized that the Philippine foreign policy should be almost fully aligned with that of the United States, as if we are two countries under the same strategic umbrella. President Duterte actually ditched that kind of thinking, and the paradigm he has introduced is very much transactional, which is quite familiar also for Americans in the case of President Trump. So he reduced that almost sacred relationship to a transactional relationship. And as far as China is concerned, his position is very clear. China is a geographic reality, unlike the United States, which is a geopolitical reality that may not be here down the road. So therefore, for him, it's important that we engage China. The challenge right now for President Duterte is this. In a year or two, he's going to be a lame duck, and questions are going to arise about how is he going to institutionalize this rapprochement with China in ways that it will last beyond his administrations, because we don't know what will be the position of the next Filipino presidents, as we have seen over the past 15 years, these wild swings in Philippine foreign policy.
That's right. It's a great point. Mr. Zhang, Senior Captain, I want to come back to you about that. Of course, you are coming from the military. It's not necessarily a foreign policy expert, but when you hear Chinese President Xi Jinping, when meeting his Filipino counterpart today, talking about both the timing and the trend, in his word, 时 and 势 in Chinese, what do you make of this logic of thinking at this relationship right now and the nature of it?
Well, I think since Mr. Duterte took office in 2016, I think he has taken a correct attitude toward the China-Philippine relationship, and also he has, I think, has done what the majority of the Philippines want. Of course, there are some differences among the policies toward China and the United States inside the Philippines we have seen in the past several years. But both sides have realized that China and the Philippines are neighbors that can't be removed. And the maritime dispute between China and the United States and the Philippines has existed for a long time. So we should not let the dispute shadow the friendship and the cooperation between the two sides. And I think during the past 3 years, the facts have shown that we are on a correct track of the between China and the Philippines. And our president said that peace, development are the main trends of our time still.
Of course, those are wonderful diplomatic words. Mr. Paul, go to you. Now, it is a great change. We're seeing geopolitics and also China-U.S. trade issue. How much opportunity does it provide to countries like the Philippines, which is quite impressive a player within ASEAN countries and has a very strong and charismatic leader right now? How much does it provide, and how careful do you think Manila needs to be from Washington's perspective?
Well, the Philippines is a complicated place, as Mr. Hidarian was outlining earlier. Mr. Duterte comes from decades of resentment against white man rule and American positions in Philippines. He's kind of a unique leader. He's not likely to be replicated next time around. He comes with his own particular background and baggage. The U.S. will have a lingering influence as a security guarantor. The structural changes that are taking place economically and strategically in the region, which have meant that China has growing clout in those areas, are not to be forgotten. They're going to be very important in Philippine calculations. But the Philippines will also be looking for counterweights to that. You see it in discussions with Philippine military and other officials who feel that their leader maybe has gone too far in the direction of China. The Philippine people will also make their own judgments about the value of Chinese contributions. Philippines has been behind in developing its infrastructure. The class cleavage in the Philippines has been a problem. If China can fill in the missing infrastructure and help to raise the quality of people's lives, that will have an important effect on the ballot box in the next go-rounds in elections in the Philippines.
Right. But what about what Chinese President Xi today mentioned, the two Chinese words? You speak great Chinese, Mr. Paul, the shi and the shi, the timing and the trend. Obviously, there are a lot involved in these two characters. You know what I'm talking about, the huge backdrop of everything. So will that provide the Philippines with a golden opportunity to maximize its possibility in the region, both in terms of security and also in terms of its trade and economic development?
Well, in terms of being the beneficiary of foreign assistance, I think what President Xi described is a fact. The first thing that Mr. Duterte did when he became president was to accept an invitation to Japan to receive promises of infrastructure and other investments. Right. And then China came along shortly after with an even larger promise. So he decided to go to China first, put that in the bag, and then go to Japan and see if he could get more. That's a sensible thing for a country leader who's got a lot of problems to address and very limited resources. So that was a smart move on his part, and I think he is capturing the sure and the sure by doing that.
Mr. Hidarian, if you think about it, the build infrastructure investment project by the Filipino president and the Belt and Road Initiative, which he has been quite supportive of, at least attending the forums in Beijing, how to really link the two together? Now, the grand planning and the vision is one thing, but really on the ground, down-to-earth cooperation, get it done, and done beautifully, could be sustainable, is another story. So how to move the vision to reality, and how, as you just said, that could be sustainable even more than just the term or terms of Mr. Duterte, is a beautiful question to be asked, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's not forget that historically Manila was the entrepot in this part of the world between the New World and between China during the galleon trade. This is the Ming Dynasty era. So for the Philippines to play an important role in the Maritime Silk Road Initiative is a return to what was a historical fact. So the Philippines is trying to regain the historical position it used to have during the colonial period. Therefore, it makes sense for the Philippines to kind of join into the BRI. Now, I think there's a historic opportunity here. while at the same time President Duterte is a sui generis, he's very unique, I think he's also broken some barriers. It's very possible that even though his successors are not going to be exactly like him with that kind of baggage of anti-colonial, anti-Western mindset, they're going to look at Duterte and say, well, you know what, we can play it a little bit aggressively and get benefits from both sides, both from US and both from China, if we are practical and pragmatic, even though they may not be exactly thinking like President Duterte. So I think there's going to be some change in terms of the trajectory of Philippine relationship with China in the long run, provided that while President Duterte is there, China makes some meaningful investments in the Philippines' public infrastructure. Back in 2016, there was $24 billion put on the table. There's a lot of private investments coming from China. But as far as public infrastructure is concerned, much of the big infrastructure is actually driven by Japan and the Philippines. So China is not yet there. That's why this visit was very important, because President Duterte is saying, I have critics at home, but if you bring in good investments, I can keep them at bay, and we can lock in this rapprochement for the long run, even when I'm gone. I think that's why this trip is very, very important.
It's a very matured relationship, shall we just put it that way, Mr. Hidarian? And also the fact that you see the manufacturing bases have been shifting from not only in China, but also to many other Southeastern Asian countries as well. Vietnam, of course, at the top of the list, but Philippines and others would also have a share. So what does that mean, this U.S.-China trade conflict for the Philippines? How do you see China's economy needs to be good for the Philippines to prosper, but at the same time you see opportunities also coming up as a result of the uncertainties, and yet you have to manage it well when it comes to the opportunities from uncertainties. Mr. Hidarian.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot to the major businesses in the Philippines and provide them advice, among other things. And the sense they have is that, you know, so far it has been a slight net positive for the Philippines. In fact, there has been a bump up in the Philippine exports in areas where China suffered some regression. Philippines is nowhere close to countries like Vietnam, who are benefiting a lot from relocation of manufacturing because of the trade war. But I think the worry in the Philippines is that if this escalation gets out of control, we pass a certain threshold, Philippines is going to get hurt, because on one hand the Philippines is getting more and more investment from China. On the other hand, US is a very important export partner. So we're going to get hit on both sides. Not to mention, trade war could actually escalate into more geopolitical confrontation, and we also do not want that. That's why actually President Duterte is a spokesman for peace, and he's calling on both sides to resolve these issues, which is a very important role that Duterte is also trying to take upon himself.
It's not fair for any Southeast Asian countries, Philippines of course included, or any country being caught in crossfire in the so-called trade conflict between China and the United States. As senior captain, I think China recognizes that very well. But the question really is, how is China likely to work with these partners? In what new ways now with this big backdrop, Mr. Zhang?
Well, we don't think we are trying to make the Philippines and other ASEAN countries to choose sides between China and the United States. I think Mr. Duterte has seized the trend of our times, that is peace, development, and cooperation. And first of all, peace, I think both sides realize that the maritime dispute between the two sides can't be settled in one day. And so we should seek for development. The development is a top priority for both countries. And also, the win-win cooperation is the best and the only way to develop our relationships.
Now we just get some of the latest news coming out of the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Filipino President Mr. Duterte. The two sides, particularly from the Chinese President Mr. Hidarian, has been advocating about before 2021 the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea better be reached, and China and the Philippines could be contributing to it fruitfully and constructively. Meanwhile, the two sides have also been talking about establishing some kind of mechanism regarding the management of oil and gas mechanism. together with some of the other mechanisms of cooperation. Now, Mr. Hidarian, I do not have the exact word yet, but these are some of the messages coming out of the meeting. So what does all of this mean? Obviously, the two sides are working on some very specific stuff.
Right. I think something important is happening here, and you have to see a parallel dynamics whereby on one hand, the Philippines is overseeing the negotiation of a potentially legally binding code of conduct by 2021. On the other hand, and these two are complementary, President Duterte is also trying to negotiate a joint oil exploration or development agreement with China in the Reed Bank, which is overlapping area between the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone and China's 9-dash line. So these two things are going to move forward, and guess what? President Duterte is in the middle of both of these important developments. So that is why I think this meeting is crucial, because the question here for President Duterte is this: am I going to get enough benefits from China so that when I go home and I get potentially criticized, I think most likely he's going to get criticized for any joint development agreements with China, do I have enough to tell the Filipino people that this is worth it? Because the Filipino people are also fundamentally practical, and they're going to look at whether this relationship is paying off the way President Duterte promised.
And of course, China is also looking at that way. The Chinese people also want an equal opportunity as well. So that's why, Mr. Paul, it seems that the two sides are already talking as much about mechanism as possible to make it sustainable. Now, earlier I mentioned about the code of the conduct in the South China Sea before 2021 or even earlier. That has been a wish coming from the Chinese president. Also mechanism regarding oil and gas, about a commission among governments between China and the Philippines, as well as a commission regarding the entrepreneurs and business communities from both sides. Mr. Paul, your quick reaction, since you know the region very well.
Well, I think one of the things you can conclude from surveying the interaction between China and its many partners in the Belt and Road is the critical element is what the local partner does, what the rules are in each country. We've seen different results in Sri Lanka and Zimbabwe, Kenya, and elsewhere. And a lot is on the Philippines' shoulders to come in, avoid corruption, provide standards for operations that meet environmental and other concerns, and that also can be tested as to the balance of benefits to the Philippine people. So it really is it's about governance and agency on the part of the Manila authorities.
Right. Mr. Zhang, Senior Captain, very encouraging. 2021 or even before that, as soon as possible. Those are the words coming from the Chinese president openly to the Filipino side and also to the international community about the code of conduct, South China Sea. Senior Captain Zhang, coming from the Chinese military, your reaction?
Well, I think this shows that China and the Philippines and other ASEAN countries, including the claimants in the South China Sea disputes, all want to peacefully settle the disputes, and we want to maintain peace and stability in this region. And this is because we know that this peace is the precondition for development, and development is the top priority for all the governments in this region.
Senior Captain Zhang Zhenshe, Mr. Douglas Paul, and Mr. Richard Hidarian, what a pleasure having the three of you and hearing different perspectives on China-Philippine ties. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay.